This program is brought to you by the Stanford Humanities Center. For more information, please visit us at shc.stanford.edu.
It's my very, very great honor this evening to bring you the Harry Camp Memorial Lecture, which is presented every other year by a distinguished scholar, artist, or writer. This lecture fund was established in 1956 by friends and associates of Harry Camp, a prominent businessman and philanthropist in San Francisco who was described by his friends as a gentle and wise humanitarian. The fund he established over half a century ago continues to bear fruit, bringing outstanding speakers to the university for public lectures that promote the study of the concept of the dignity and the worth of the individual. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome the eminent political theorist and historian Quentin Skinner. Professor Skinner is Barber Beaumont Professor of the Humanities and co-director of the Center for the Study of the History of Political Thought at Queen Mary University of London. He has published extensively on the evolution of political thought in early modern Europe. His interests and publications range widely over the rocky and deeply corrugated terrain of the period roughly 1400 to 1800 in Europe, when a host of new or revived political ideas emerged to challenge the religious, literary, and political formations of the Middle Ages. He has written on Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, Shakespeare, and many others. He received the Wolfson History Prize for the Foundations of Modern Political Thought from 1978, a landmark study that the Times Literary Supplement proclaimed one of the most important 100 books published since the Second World War. He holds dozens of honorary degrees and is the recipient of so many prizes that it would detain me at the lectern for too long to mention them all. Throughout his career, Professor Skinner has been a model for many, including many of us in this room, about how to write a history of ideas that is thoroughly contextualized in its historical milieu. I have so many times returned to his 1969 article on meaning and understanding in the history of ideas for a refresher course on how to avoid some of the many traps that await the historian who attempts the perilous task of recovering a lost intellectual world. Before I hand the podium to him, let me close by expressing the collective and effusive thanks of the Stanford community for Professor Skinner's extraordinary intellectual generosity during his visit here. In the space of 4 short days, he has agreed to a conversational lunch with the graduate students in the history department, to a lecture on rhetoric and Shakespeare in the English department, to an undergraduate class, to this lecture, and tomorrow to a paper at the Political Theory Workshop, not to mention approximately 4 million lunches and coffees with colleagues. We are grateful that he seems to have taken very much to heart the injunctions to selfless civic virtue of the great Renaissance figures he has spent a lifetime studying. Professor Skinner will speak for approximately 1 hour. There will then be a half an hour of Q&A. We will have microphones going around. If you have a comment, please phrase it in the form of one question. And please join me in welcoming Professor Quentin Skinner.
Well, Professor Winter, thank you enormously much for these deeply generous, very welcoming words. It is a great honor to be invited to deliver the Harry Camp lecture, and the list of previous lecturers is an extremely inspiring one, unless you're standing where I am, in which case it's an extremely daunting one. As has been noted, the requirement of the occasion is that the lecturer should address an issue, I'm quoting, concerned with the dignity and worth of the individual, both in its historical development and in its present significance. And that was what decided me to try to say something about the concept of liberty, which is surely the core concept in our thinking about the dignity and worth of the individual. Now, since in speaking of liberty or freedom, I shall use those terms interchangeably, we are undoubtedly referring to one of our core moral and political values, it would be good if I could work towards a definition of the term on which we might, at least in principle, be able to agree. But here I am a Nietzschean, and that's, of course, reflected in my title. And what Nietzsche has to say about these definitions in the Genealogy of Morality. Concepts that have histories, he suggests, cannot have definitions. This is a really deep point. Of course, some concepts have definitions, but if they have a history, they can't. Freedom is unquestionably one such concept, because the meaning and the application of the term have been contested throughout the history of the modern world. So, there's a big methodological question: how, in such a case, should we proceed? And I'm going to follow Nietzsche's suggestion, which is by genealogy, trying to see how the concept evolved in our culture, but also how it was contested, how rival understandings of how to think about it emerged and did battle. Nietzsche loves this idea that concepts, I mean, Wittgenstein tells us concepts are tools. Nietzsche prefers to say, no, they're weapons. We're doing battle here, and these are all ideological conflicts. So this kind of genealogy is what I shall attempt. However, this is obviously a vast undertaking, and I'm going to have to do something arbitrary to bring my materials under some kind of control. So what I've decided to do, it is arbitrary, is to concentrate on the genealogy as it unfolds in the English language tradition of classical liberal political philosophy. Why? Because if I make that my focus, I'm not simply tracing a descent or a series of descents. I'm also pointing to a set of views that are alive in our culture here and now, and which help to supply many of us with an element of our moral and political identity. Okay, to begin. Within the classical liberal tradition, the earliest treatise in which the concepts of civil and political liberty are systematically analysed is also, as it happens, one of the most important works of political philosophy in the English language, and that is Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, first published in 1651. Chapter 21 of Hobbes' Leviathan is entitled Of the Liberty of Subjects, and that really inaugurates the modern discussion. I don't think that's in dispute, and that's why I'm going to start there. Now, a further merit of beginning with Hobbes is that his understanding of civil liberty has turned out to be extraordinarily influential, so that his analysis is also a very familiar one, as this shows us at once. Within the classical liberal tradition, the earliest treatise in which the concepts of civil and political liberty are analysed, as I say, is Hobbes, and we're looking at the analysis. And I've called this the liberal concept. And as you see, it's a very simple concept. It just has two components. It proposes that for an individual to enjoy freedom as a citizen of a state, there must be power on the part of the individual to act in pursuit of a given option, or at least alternative, and there must be no interference with the exercise of that power by any external agency. So let me take these two ideas in turn. First, power. Hobbes insists, and I think myself this is a valuable insistence, that it makes no sense to talk about freedom of action except in the relation to whether you have a power to perform that action or not. That's contrary to a very strong tendency in contemporary Anglophone political philosophy, which is to suppose, I mean, I quote Jerry Cohen, for example, in his essay, Freedom and Money, that inability is a sufficient condition of unfreedom. Or Amartya Sen makes the same claim in his great treatise on freedom and development. I quote, "If you are unable to perform an action, you are unfree to perform it." Now, Hobbes suggests, avant la lettre, obviously, but usefully, that that is not a good way to think about the relationship. He would want to say that if you lack the power to act in a certain way, I don't know what, the power to walk on water, then you're neither free to do that, nor are you unfree to do that, because you are simply unable to do it. And if you're simply unable, the question of freedom doesn't arise. You're not free, but you're not unfree. We're in the wrong discourse. You're just unable. Now, you can put that point the other way around, and if you do so, you bring out its philosophical significance, which is that if you are unfree to act in some particular way, that must be because you have been disempowered. Okay? By some identifiable agency. This is the point that Foucault, in his Discourses of Power, has made famous in our time. All talk about freedom is nested within discourses of power, and that seems to me right, and that's the Hobbesian thought. Foucault, of course, taking it from Hobbes. Okay, I turn secondly to this idea of interference. Hobbes's claim here is, in effect, about how to understand this idea of disempowerment. You're said to be disempowered, and hence unfree, if and only if someone has interfered with your capacity to exercise a power. So on this analysis, freedom simply consists in absence of interference by such external agencies. So, by the way, I mean, that explains why in current political theory, freedom is so often described as a negative concept. I mean, not wrongly, because the suggestion that we've got here is that the presence of freedom is always marked by an absence. And if you ask, well, what absence? The answer is absence of interference. That marks the presence of liberty. So there's Hobbes's view, but obviously that doesn't get us very far, because if freedom turns out to consist in absence of interference, then what is interference? I mean, that's not a clear concept at all. But it turns out that freedom is the blank, freedom is the negative concept. So what we've actually got to understand is interference. That's where all the conceptual work is being done. Now, of course, Hobbes hasn't failed to notice that, and he goes on to give us an account of interference. And again, it's an extremely straightforward one. So here's Hobbes's understanding of the concept of interference. External agencies are said to interfere when they act on the body of an individual in such a way that an action within the power of the individual is prevented or compelled. Notice always two modalities for taking away freedom. You can stop someone from acting, or you can prevent them from doing anything else. So limiting choices, two modalities of limiting choices, due to the application of physical force by the external agency in such a way that any alternative is rendered impossible. So we've arrived at Hobbes's definition of freedom. Freedom is, I quote the beginning of chapter 21, absence of external impediments to motion. Well, there is the Hobbesian analysis, so may we just contemplate it for a moment. And as you do so, you will immediately notice one very important implication which I need to underline. It's said to be only bodily interference that takes away freedom of action. So the implication here is that if it is only your will that is coerced, I mean, if, for example, you only obey the law because you're frightened of the consequences of disobedience, which is the state's standard assumption about you, then what Hobbes wants to say is that when you obey the law, you are nevertheless acting freely, and you are always free to disobey. Because this is only coercion of the will, and that does not take away freedom. So again, chapter 21 of Leviathan, fear and liberty are consistent. Now, Hobbes really means that. And he doesn't illustrate it, but one can illustrate it with an example which is extremely common in early modern philosophy. John Locke, for example, uses it. And this is the example of the highwayman. The highwayman is the person who points the gun and says, your money or your life. Hobbes says, you're being offered a choice. That's what you have to recognize. You're being offered a choice. You could decide to hand over your money, or you could decide to hand over your life. But choice is freedom, and that's a choice. And Hobbes summarizes this in a nasty joke when he says that when you decide to hand over your money, you not only do it willingly and therefore freely, but very willingly. So there's the Hobbesian analysis of what I'm calling the liberal view of freedom. It's a version of that view. And it's important for me to add, because I'm doing genealogy this evening, that this way of thinking remains widely endorsed in contemporary political philosophy. For example, you'll find exactly this view elaborated and defended in two of the most ambitious recent works on the theory of individual freedom. I'm thinking of Ian Carter's book with Oxford, The Measure of Freedom, or Matthew Kramer's book, also with Oxford, The Quality of Freedom. So this genealogical strand runs right down into our own time. Looking at this, though, you might think, look, something has obviously gone wrong in the Hobbesian analysis, and I'm very happy about the laughter that there was a minute or so ago, because, you know, of course, we're going to say, well, something is amiss with this analysis, that there is compatibility of freedom with coercion of the will. And the view that there is something amiss with that thought was what got taken up in the next generation after Thomas Hobbes. So my genealogy is already on the move. I'm moving down into this next generation, and in particular, in the criticism to be found in the most celebrated work of political philosophy in the Anglophone tradition of that next generation, namely John Locke's two treatises of government, first published in 1689. So I now want to say a word about Locke's retort to Hobbes. Locke agrees, of course, that you are unfree to act if you're prevented bodily from exercising a power. I mean, it would be remarkable to deny that. You would get into the Stoic paradoxes of freedom if you denied that. But Locke wants to insist that you will also be rendered unfree whenever your will is coerced. Here is Locke in paragraph 176 of the second treatise. Should a robber break into my house and with a dagger at my throat make me seal documents to convey my estate to him, would that give him title? Well, the question is purely rhetorical, because what Locke wants you to agree is that in such a predicament you really do not have an alternative. It's really idle to say that you have an alternative. So coercion of the will may not render the action impossible, which of course is Hobbes's condition, the impossibility condition, but it certainly renders it what Locke calls ineligible. Ineligible. That's to say, it's not an object of choice. You would never choose it. So to that degree, you just are not free. So the addition of Locke's critique makes the genealogy look like this. We now have Thomas Hobbes over on the extreme left wing. He doesn't want to be there, but that's where I've put him. There is Hobbes's analysis coming down the left-hand side, or most people within the classical liberal tradition have wanted to say that a bending of the will by coercion also takes away freedom of action. Notice, however, that we're now dealing with a concept that makes no appearance in Hobbes's analysis as it's coming down the left-hand side here, that of coercion. And indeed, according to this view, notice, if you're going to understand freedom, that is one of the fundamental concepts that you've got to understand. Now you see how clever Hobbes was, because what do we mean by coercion? That's not a clear concept at all. But it's suddenly been made central to the liberal analysis. So you would think that Locke, the founder, as it were, of the Anglo-American liberal story, would have something to tell us about coercion. He gives no analysis of this concept in the treatises of government. It's a very surprising omission. All he does is to give us some of what he takes to be clear examples of coercion. So, you know, the usual fatal move in analytical political philosophy, he invites you to consult your intuitions. And you think, yes, that is definitely coercion. And he gives 4 examples. Threats, promises, offers, bribes. All of these, he says, bend the will, and in that way take away your freedom. But don't those examples point to the need for an analysis? Because if we were consulting our intuitions, we would surely want to say, this list is looking a bit dubious. I mean, consider, for example, the fact that the list includes bribes. Is it really true that if I offer you a bribe, I coerce you into acting in a certain way? I mean, suppose a politician who is accused in court of having accepted a bribe assures the judge that he should not be held responsible because the sum of money involved was simply so enormous that he had no choice but to offer it. He couldn't fail to take it. That's not going to be a legal defense, oddly enough. So what this shows is that the Lockean account needs something that Hobbes deliberately keeps free of. We've got to engage with this idea of what it means for the will to be coerced. That's to say, what's to count as the sort and the extent of the bending of the will that we do want to say takes away freedom. That's not something that Locke provides. And as far as I can see, that is what I want to say. As far as I can see, there's no one in the Anglophone classical liberal tradition who really faces this squarely until Jeremy Bentham does in his great treatise written in the 1780s called On the Limits of the Penal Branch of Legislation. So the genealogy is now moving from the late 17th century down towards the late 18th century. Bentham proposes that we need to distinguish two different ways in which you can bend someone's will, fundamentally two opposed ways. One is that you can promise that you will reward them for compliance with your will. So I say something like, if you do what I want, I'll give you $1 million. Now, if you refuse, you're no worse off. If you accept, you're better off. You're $1 million better off. Contrast that, Bentham says, well, he doesn't give the dollars example. Contrast that with the case where I threaten you with penalties for non-compliance with my will. So, for example, I say, if you don't do what I say, I'll kill you. So in that case, you either comply with my will, in which case you're no better off, or you don't comply with my will, in which case you're substantially worse off. In fact, you're dead. Now, Bentham's proposal is that coercion we can only properly speak of in the second type of case. The second type of case is coercion. That is, threatening me with penalties for non-compliance. As long, Bentham adds, as certain features of the threat itself are fulfilled. And these are, I think, ingenious and important. One is the threat must be credible. That's to say, you're going to have to avoid this threat. Secondly, the threat must be serious. That's to say, it's well worth avoiding it. And thirdly, it's got to be immediate, so to speak. You can't run away. You're going to have to face it. So if there is a threat which fulfills those three criteria, then coercion is what we're facing. Now, in contemporary political philosophy, there's been a lot of work done on coercion, and some of the classic work was done by Robert Nozick, especially a major essay of his called Coercion. And he, of course, uses Bentham's analysis. Everyone has used Bentham's analysis. And he ingeniously points out that it doesn't quite work because you can think of cases where there would be a reward which is nevertheless coercive. But what I think we would have to say, and which even Nozick agrees with, is that Bentham has isolated the paradigm case of coercion. And so I think we can incorporate the refinement. Coercion is rendering alternatives ineligible, standardly and basically by means of threats, so long as the threats are credible, immediate, and serious. Okay, is that perhaps the analysis of freedom that you want? If so, this is a very short lecture. Now, it's worth asking that question because within the classical liberal tradition, the answer that would unhesitatingly have been given for a long time was yes, that is it. That's the analysis we want of the idea of individual freedom. And indeed, you might reflect on the most celebrated single contribution in our time to my subject this evening, namely Isaiah Berlin's famous essay, Two Concepts of Liberty. Among the two concepts that he analyzes, Berlin has a preferred account of freedom. So what is his preferred account? You're looking at it. That's his preferred account. So it's entitled to our very respectful attention because notice, again, the genealogy has come right down to our time. However, within the liberal tradition, there arose a further complicating moment with the publication of what is undoubtedly the most celebrated text on my exact topic this evening, namely John Stuart Mill's essay called On Liberty of 1859. One of the moves that Mill makes in that very original text is to point out that the liberal tradition thus far, and he's thinking of what I've been talking about, he's thinking about Hobbes, he's thinking about Locke, he's thinking about the utilitarians, of course, and especially Bentham, that tradition endorses one principle that Mill considers questionable. And there it is. I'm not allowed to move because of the, otherwise I would come and point, but okay? Oh, is that right? You should have told me that. I can wander about. No, all right, no, I won't wander about. I told you, didn't I? Okay, I promise not to wander about. But it's at the middle at the top. It's at the middle at the top of the chart. That freedom consists in the absence of interference with the exercise of your powers by external agencies. At the middle at the top, by external agencies. That's to say, by another person, or by a group, or, of course, important for these writers, natural agencies can take away freedom. Anything that threatens to leave you powerless. But what Mill asks in chapter 3 of the essay on liberty is this. Is it true that freedom is necessarily interpersonal in this way that we're looking at? Or could it be the case, somehow, that the agent who takes away your freedom could be you? It's not interpersonal, that you could be the agent of the destruction of your own freedom. Well, as soon as you entertain that thought, the liberal tradition begins to look a lot more complicated. And this complication is one of the major nodes of late 19th century social and political philosophy, as people begin to ask, can we make sense of this radical extension of the classical liberal tradition? So here it is, with the extension added. No interference by external agencies, or some people want to add by the self. The self can prevent or compel its own actions due to the operation of what? I mean, how are we going to start to fill this out? That's the analytical challenge that we now face. Well, here we are beginning to wade into extremely deep philosophical waters about the notion of the self, and is it a divided notion in the way that this is presupposing. But the writers that I'm interested in this tradition this evening are resourceful about this and have a number of answers, and here is the first. Now here the suggestion is that the will, so to speak, can ally itself either with reason or with some passion of the soul, as Descartes would call it, some passion de l'âme, I mean anger or envy or hatred or something that just blows you away, where the resulting action is motivated not by one of those passions, but by reason conquering those passions. The resulting action is said to be free. That's a free action. So notice, very strong conceptual connection being suggested here between freedom and reason. Where, on the other hand, it is passion that has blown you away, the resulting action is held to be not fully free. And the writers who like to think in these terms, from the 17th century onwards, make a distinction here between liberty and license. If you're acting out of passion, that is not free action, that is licentious action. It's only if you're acting according to freedom as your motive that you act freely. Now, there are deep roots for that view. I mean, for example, what I've just said is a paraphrase of what John Locke already says in his essay concerning human understanding of 1690. Mill certainly alludes to this idea, especially when he's comparing the higher and lower pleasures, when he's criticizing Bentham. But Mill isn't so much interested in A. Mill is much more interested in what he takes to be a second possible internal constraint on our freedom, and it's this. Now, Mill introduces this suggestion with the claim that, as he says at the start of the essay, I quote, "In our time," he's speaking of mid-Victorian England, "the yoke of law has become lighter, but the yoke of opinion has become heavier." I think that's right, inasmuch as most of the protests that were offered in the name of freedom in the early modern period were offered in the name of freedom as against the state. But Mill, who is here closely following his elder contemporary Tocqueville, is much more impressed by the power not of the state but of civil society within the state to limit your freedom. And that happens through demands for conformity to convention. Demands of civil society, they're implicit demands of civil society for you to follow certain norms and conventions of behavior. And Mill thinks that where that demand is very strong, as he thought it was in 19th century Britain, then the effect will be to cause you inauthentically to internalize those social norms until you follow them in preference to your authentic desires. And he's very concerned about this point. I quote chapter 3, it's a beautiful epigrammatic passage of the Essay on Liberty. The people of England think themselves free, but they choose what is customary in preference to their inclination, until it does not occur to them to have any inclination except for what is customary. So people, this is Mill's point, are not reflecting on their choices. And if you don't stand back in this Socratic way that he always asks you to do from your choices, then they're not genuinely free choices because you're simply allowing the circumpressures of your society to dictate what you think are your choices. Now, I've spoken of Mill as the great spokesman for that view in the Anglophone classical tradition of liberalism, and I think that is correct. But notice, of course, that came down to our time in existentialist moral philosophy, which is an enormous extension of just that idea of how the self can enslave the self through inauthenticity. Let me round off this part of my discussion by adding a word about one other possibility in late 19th century social philosophy, although I have to say that this will cause me to skid off my purely English language track just for a moment, although the works I want to talk about are all translated into the English language. So here is the possibility that I want to put before you. The idea that you might undermine your own freedom by acting with a consciousness which is false. False to what? False to your own true or real interests. Maybe not false to your phenomenal desires, but false to your real interests. Notice how close Mill comes to this when he talks about the permanent interests of men. He's talking about men always, of course, as progressive beings. The permanent interests of men as progressive beings. But of course, the classic expression in late 19th century social philosophy of this view is in Karl Marx. And Marx's key suggestion, as of course you know, is that social being determines consciousness. So if your consciousness is determined by a society in which freedom of action is conceived of in bourgeois terms, then you will become the agent of your own servitude, because you will be endorsing a bourgeois, and Marx would wish to say, a false understanding of what is in your real interests. And of course, I don't need to tell you that that strand of the genealogy has also come powerfully down into our own times, especially through the German tradition. But Habermas, the great exponent of the distinction between phenomenal desires and real interests in social philosophy in our time, has of course been in the English language since the 1960s. And so this part of the liberal story also comes down to our time. That's the most important thing. I seem to be in Foucauldian mood a bit this evening. Foucault, famous, of course, for the claim that there's no such thing as an exhaustive taxonomy. That must be right. And in any case, I want to leave the inquiry as open as we can possibly leave it. We are talking about freedom. So I would be very happy if people had more to say about that in discussion. By the way, of course, the most obvious thing that's going to occur to us is the unconscious. I mean, Freud always saw himself as a theorist of freedom, and with a very unfortunately sexist way of putting it, but he said the aspiration of his theory was to make people a master in their own house again. That's to say, well, you all know the theory, and it skids away from social philosophy, so I haven't talked about it, but there might be other candidates besides Freud's theory. Okay. We now have, I think you'd agree, an array of different conceptions of freedom, and it's definitely beginning to look like a genealogy in that some choices are required. There are disputes here which are going to be irresolvable. Some people are going to say, we don't want to add the self. Some are going to say, we have to add the self. Some are going to say, the external inferiorness has to be only bodily. Some are going to say, it includes the will. So there's no way of turning this into a narrative now. This is the collision that Nietzsche talks about. However, we should notice that all of what you're looking at have one basic element in common as they explicate freedom. They all think of it as absence of interference. Notice, interference turns out to be an incredibly complex concept. There it is at the top. It's doing all the work. It's all about what it means for there to be interference. Intrusions of various kinds. They may well up from you. They may be circumpressures of your society. They may come from the state. They're all intrusions. They're all interferences. But towards the very end of the 19th century, which is where my genealogy has now reached, a number of Anglophone political philosophers begin to argue that what you're looking at is radically incomplete. And these are the people who are drawing on the philosophy of Hegel, who had argued, as of course we all know, that to think of liberty like this, as Hegel says in a wonderful passage in The Philosophy of Right, only the English could be so crude. I mean, this is freedom? You haven't even started. This is the negative moment of a dialectic. Freedom is a dialectical moment. You're free from something, but you're also free to do something. Well, of course, the liberal tradition is not without a response to Hegel, and you find the response at the top of the chart. We want to be impeded. If you ask, impeded from doing what? The answer is impeded from doing whatever you want. That's the glory of the liberal tradition. It doesn't block that off. You could say, therefore, that there's always a kind of positive element in the notion of freedom, because you can always ask why you want to be free from impediments. I mean, what is this freedom for? Why is it a value for you? And that's a positive question. But I do think it's a great strength of this tradition that I've so far laid out, that it answers the Hegelian question with whatever you want. Although, of course, and Mill is famous for this, within the bounds of what he calls the harm principle. Whatever you want, provided it doesn't harm others. But I need at this stage to notice a very different answer that rose to prominence in English language political philosophy at the very end of the 19th century. And according to the view of things that I now want to say a word about, we want to be free, not in order merely to act at will, so that it's a kind of blank space, but rather in order to act in such a way, and here's the Hegelian thought, in such a way as to realize the essence of your nature. That is freedom. In Anglophone political philosophy, the leading exponent of this view was the philosopher called T.H. Green, although of course Bradley, Bosanquet, a large number of philosophers at the turn of the 19th into the 20th centuries. Green wrote an essay called On the Different Meanings of Freedom. And he ends by saying, and I quote him, "To be free is to have realized that which we have it in ourselves to become." So being and becoming, very important in this Hegelian way of thinking about freedom. And according to this view, we ought therefore to characterize as free, that's to say as truly free, wirklich, real freedom, as Hegel would say, only those persons who, as Green puts it, have in fact acted in such a way as to realize the essence of their nature. So notice that a wide conceptual gulf has now opened up at this point between this view and everything that we've so far looked at. The Hegelians do not think of freedom as absence of interference on any understanding of interference. Rather, they are claiming that freedom is self-realization. So notice what has happened is that this tradition of thinking has helped itself to a massive additional premise, which is that human nature is normative. There's a normativity in human nature, which this is saluting. And of course, that's Hegel's objection to the liberal tradition. It doesn't accept the normativity of human nature. Now, you may not think it makes sense to say that human nature is normative, although we do talk like this. We say of certain things that was completely inhuman. Or we say, yes, we do say that, don't we? So it's in our thinking that human nature might be normative. And if you are willing to entertain that thought, then obviously there are going to be as many different theories of liberty as self-realization as there are coherent views about what constitutes the essence of what it is to be truly human, that normative essence of human nature. So we need to ask, well, what view about the normativity of human nature did these writers actually espouse? Well, you could espouse many, I guess, but if you think about the Western way of tradition of thinking about this in very general terms, we've really only ever espoused two large pictures at this point. One is classical and one is Christian. Now, Green is a Christian, and he's very taken with the idea, this Christian paradox, that what freedom might be is service. Service to God might be freedom, because it's in service to God that you realize the essence of your nature. Okay, well, there is a very strong story. Of course, it's the one that Nietzsche is denouncing, isn't it, in the Genealogy of Morality? That's the slave morality. But that's not a political theory. On the contrary, that's sort of a rejection of politics. If we're talking about a political theory of this kind, then we are driven back into the classical story that the way in which we most fully realize ourselves, that's to say, the arena for our talents, the arena for our virtues, is the civic arena. And that it's not service of God, but service of fellow human beings that discloses you as a free person. So I'm suggesting we've inherited two principal views about this idea that liberty has this positive concept. And one is essentially the Aristotelian view, that we are the zoon politikon, we are the political animal. And that's what it is to be free. It's to realize that that's your nature. And here, of course, is the superseding view that, that our true nature is spiritual. Now, I again want to emphasize that this way of thinking has come right down into our own time. Amongst recent philosophers who have unambiguously taken up position A, which of course is all I'm talking about because I'm talking about politics this evening, the most prominent has been Hannah Arendt, hasn't it? Especially in her wonderful essay called What is Freedom? I quote it. Freedom is politics. Now that is a wonderful remark. I mean, she's not saying freedom requires politics, or she's saying the activity of politics is the arena in which your virtues and your talents are put to work in such a way as to make you most fully the free person that you have it in yourself to become. So there is your self-realized. Another Hegelian, which, I mean, I think this is, I suppose, mediated through Heidegger in Hannah Arendt's case, but a pure Hegelian writing in the English language in our time is Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor, in his great treatise, Sources of the Self, has this distinction where he wants to say freedom is usually understood as an opportunity concept, as he calls it. That's to say, to be free is just to have options, which of course is what we're seeing all over the left-hand side of this genealogy. But he wants to say, look, that's not how to think about freedom. Freedom is not an opportunity concept, it is an exercise concept. That's to say, I can only tell if you are a free person once I've seen how you conduct yourself. And of course, I mean, Homo economicus, well, maybe we can talk about this. I want to pause at this juncture because I think it would be quite generally agreed, and you'd have to be a quite wide-minded contemporary analytical philosopher in political theory to think that we need to incorporate so much. I mean, what is currently the latest and therefore in bold would be unhesitatingly crossed out by a lot of the people I've talked about down the left-hand side. But that this, somewhere here, we've now got the genealogy. If you think that, then I think you're missing an element in the genealogy which has indeed been largely successfully effaced by the ideological triumph of classical liberalism, but which needs crucially, I think, to be added to the picture. And my desire to add something to the picture which is not there, we've left Isaiah Berlin very far behind, haven't we? My desire to add something to the picture which is not there is really my excuse for standing before you this evening, and it's with this further force that I want to end. I can best begin by suggesting that we can see what's missing by making a point about Hobbes's argument that commentators on Hobbes's philosophy never seem to point out, which is that when he gives you this story, which I've put all the way down the left-hand side, this is extremely polemical. I mean, it begins a story which has become our story, so we're prone not to see that this is a fiercely polemical thing that he's doing in talking about freedom. He is trying to discredit a completely different way of thinking about freedom. And look how successful it was. I mean, this is a story that rolls through right down into contemporary political theory. So what Hobbes was objecting to has rather got effaced. Now, to see the contention that Hobbes is trying to discredit, I think the best thing to do is to go back to what is in fact one of the founding texts of modern Western political theory, and that is the Codex of Roman Law. The Codex of Roman Law, which has an extraordinary influence in all our cultures, begins by making a distinction between the figure of the free man or woman, liber homo, the free man or woman, and the figure of the slave. Now, according to this view, of course, ex hypothesi, a slave is unfree. But notice that in order to understand what freedom is on this account, what you crucially need to understand is what makes a slave unfree. Then you'll understand freedom. Now, it's crucial to see that the answer is nothing to do with interference. I mean, this was something that was very prominent in Roman comedy and in classical reflections on slavery. Plautus has slave characters in Plautus whose master is either completely benign or is always away. They do whatever they want. This is put on the Roman stage. They're not interfered with in the pursuit of their goals, but they're still slaves. So that's what makes those comedies so uneasy. A slave who only ever did his master's bidding and did it willingly would never suffer coercion, and so you'd have a deep paradox, a free slave. By contrast, many free citizens in antiquity would have had extremely circumscribed lives, especially circumscribed by poverty. So what is this distinction between the free and the slave? The answer given in the Roman law, and it's extremely influential, is that it's the mere fact of having a master that makes you unfree. The mere fact, that is, of living in a state of dependence on the arbitrary will of somebody else. As the Digest of Roman Law expresses the point, it's the fact of living in potestate, that's to say, within someone's power, and hence at their mercy. That's what takes away freedom. That's what takes away your status as a liber homo. Homo, of course, in Latin meaning man or woman, a free man or woman. So here's the claim. It's nothing to do with non-interference. Its absence of dependence is the core idea of what it is to be free. And the reason is that you will not be a liber homo, free man or woman, but you will be a slave if there could be interference contrary to your interests and undertaken with impunity because of your dependence on the arbitrary will of somebody else. There's the fundamental claim, so let's inscribe it. Now notice that there is a continuity here with most liberal accounts of freedom. That's to say, the presence of freedom is still said to be marked by an absence. But it's not absence of interference, it's absence of dependence. But there's also a major contrast here with the classical liberal story, because it's possible on this account to be unfree even if there is no interference with the exercise of your powers and not even any threat of any such interference. You could still be unfree. Now that claim looks absurd to some contemporary political theorists. For example, Matthew Kramer in his book, The Quality of Freedom, which by the way is the longest book review I've ever received. Matthew says, how can there be loss of freedom when there is no interference? How can that be? Well, according to the writers I'm here talking about, whom I want to call neo-Roman writers on freedom, it can be the case, and in two related ways. First, there's an epistemological point to be made. If you are wholly dependent on the goodwill of someone else, then you never act according to your own will, which is what freedom requires. Any action you perform will always be the outcome both of your own will and of the silent permission of the person on whose goodwill you depend, who could, with impunity, have stopped you, but chose not to. That's always going to be there, that permission. So all of what look like free actions are actually permissions. So you never act autonomously. So there's the first claim. It's the fact of dependence that takes away freedom of action. You're never autonomous. Second point that the neo-Roman writers make stems from the consideration that it's obvious that you couldn't live subject to the arbitrary will of someone in any domain of your life, let alone if you're a chattel slave in every domain of your life. But you couldn't remain for long ignorant of being in someone's power in any domain of your life without noticing it. I mean, you're quickly going to notice that. But as soon as you notice it, what's going to happen? It's going to generate self-censorship. It cannot fail to generate self-censorship. And there's the second way in which your freedom is going to be undermined. Let me just spell that out. This is really the core claim, I think. I mean, the first claim is very important because it's about how power is silent. You could say classical liberalism is very bad about power being silent. It always wants to see the interference, see the noise. But some power is completely silent. This is what this tradition is more sensitive to, I think. And the way this core claim works is that if you know that your predicament is that you are in somebody's power, you never know what might happen to you. You're in a power. You don't know what could happen. Anything could happen. Maybe nothing will happen, or maybe nothing bad will happen, but anything could happen. So you're going to want to do everything in respect of the person at whose mercy you are living to keep out of trouble. So you cannot fail to self-censor systematically in the hope of keeping out of trouble. You don't know what the trouble is, but you have to mold yourself in such a way that you do your best to keep out of trouble. Summarized by Tacitus in a very unpleasant epigram, but you see what he's saying, as he says there is no chance for a slave, he means a true slave, a chattel slave, not to be slavish. How could you be other than slavish? I mean, because that's your existential predicament. Okay, as you have seen with the rise of what we've got on the board, which I've now pushed over to the right wing, which is where it all belongs, with the rise of this story that I've told you, this mainly gets effaced, but not entirely. There's a kind of rocky descent that we can end this lecture by looking at, because we can ask this question. Look, I'm not talking about chattel slavery. This is the question is very precisely formulated. Who live as slaves in some domain of their life, some domain or other, in which you are in someone's power? If that's true in any domain of your life, then you are living in that domain as a slave. Okay, let's see what the answers that were given to that question were. The main answer given in the 17th century, the answer given by James Harrington to Hobbes in the most important English language 17th century treatise on republicanism, James Harrington's Oceana of 1656, was this. Anyone who lives as the subject of a monarch lives as a slave in certain domains of their life. Because all monarchs, as Harrington says, have prerogatives. But prerogatives are, ex hypothesi, discretionary powers. But to the extent that a monarch has discretionary powers, their subjects depend on that monarch's will. It's arbitrary. But to live in any domain of your life in the state of dependence on someone's arbitrary will is what it is to lack freedom. Now, the next claim we find becomes very important with the emergence of the empires of the Enlightenment period. All who live in colonies under imperial powers live as slaves. So, that is the argument used against the British by the 13 American colonies in 1776. And it's the argument used by such defenders of the American colonists in England as Joseph Priestley, Richard Price, and of course, above all, Thomas Paine. The common core of their argument, it's best known as Paine's argument, is that if you are governed, and especially if you are taxed by a colonial power, and thus have no representation in the legislative that's imposing those taxes, that's to say that in that domain of your life, you are entirely dependent on the goodwill of that representative assembly for the level of taxation that is imposed. But this dependency, as the colonists claim in the Declaration of 1776, serves in itself to take away freedom in that domain, because they're entirely at the mercy of the English Parliament as to what level of taxation will be imposed, and so their property is in permanent jeopardy, because they're subject to arbitrary power. So that explains why the Revolutionary Declaration of 1776 was called, and still is called, the Declaration of Independence. Independence from what? Well, from dependence, of course. In declaration of not being dependent on the arbitrary powers that are lodged in the British Constitution. So notice that this country is founded on this view of what it is to be a free person. Now, a further answer comes powerfully to the fore in the revolutionary decades of the 1790s and not before time. All women who lack independent means live as slaves. This is Mary Wollstonecraft's central theme in the pioneering, remarkable text of 1792, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. The starting point is with the fact that most women, or at least very many women, are or were at the time economically dependent on men. The effect, I quote Wollstonecraft, is that in order to survive, such women have to learn how to become the sort of people that men like. And to the extent that that is how they are obliged to form their characters, they cannot act autonomously. In a number of domains of their lives, these people are not free. Now, John Stuart Mill writes the last of his major political texts in 1869, 10 years after the essay on liberty, and his tract, as I'm sure you know, is called The Subjection of Women. It's a little observed fact about John Stuart Mill that he appears as the 19th century apostle of classical liberalism, but he changes his mind. He comes over to this view, and he begins the tract on the subjection of women by saying that because women do not even have a testamentary will, which was true in England at that time, they couldn't make their own will, so he's punning on will. They can't make their own will, so in that domain of their life, they don't have a will. And he says at the beginning of chapter 1, I see no difference between the position of such women and that of bond slaves. So Mill, the great apostle of liberalism, in his late life becomes what I'm calling a neo-Roman theorist of liberty. Now, how about this? Have they been eliminated? What about this? Deunionized labour forces, bosses who have it within their power to dismiss at will and with impunity. There are certain examples of that in my country. I'm sure this is a more virtuous country than mine. we have to ask if these citizens are, on this account, living in that domain of their life as free men and women. What about this? Many democratic states, certainly mine, and again I'm sure America is more virtuous, possess extensive powers of surveillance over their citizens that can be exercised without the consent or even the knowledge of those citizens. Now, so far, criticism has tended to focus on the exercise of those powers, and it's agreed that the exercise of these powers is an affront to privacy, but that the payoff is security, and that's a quotation from President Obama. But on the view of liberty that I am now considering, this is not at all the right way to analyze the costs and benefits. On the Neo-Roman account, it's not the exercise of these powers, but the existence of these powers which matters and is the affront. And the affront is not to privacy, it's an affront to liberty, both because it is arbitrary, we don't know what use could be made of it, and because, since we don't know what use could be made of it, we're very liable to start to self-censor. So there's a paradigm of unfreedom on this account. Worrying. Well, here I draw to a close. In fact, I'm a minute over 7 o'clock, but I've got one. Is that all right? Because I really want this extra minute, because I want to place before you the complete genealogy with all the bits and pieces taken out. That's to say, all the bold which introduced each section, and there it is. And with the whole thing in front of us, the reason I want this final minute is to say, well, what's the point of these remarks? What is the point of genealogy? I want to make 2 points here, in fact, and the first is that genealogy, in the way that I've been laying it out, is always critique. Genealogy is critique. Critique of what? Conceptual analysis. And the way that that works in the present instance is as follows. We are repeatedly told in contemporary Anglo-American political philosophy that there is, I quote John Rawls, one coherent way of thinking about liberty. It is a negative concept, and it consists in the absence of interference. Now that is the analysis of freedom that underlies Rawls's account of justice as equal freedom. But there isn't just one way of coherently analyzing the concept of freedom in our time. I've spoken of writers like Arendt and Taylor, who don't think about it in these terms at all, but they think coherently. And I've spoken of a legal tradition which insists that even if liberty is seen as negative, it's not to be seen in terms of interference, but on the contrary, of domination and dependence. Each of these positions, and we end up with 3 major features of a genealogical tree, are, I think, coherent in their own terms. My other and final point is that while each of these accounts is, I think, coherent in its own terms, you can't combine them. This is genealogy. You can't get this to be a concept, the concept of liberty. You're going to have to make some choices because they don't fit together. So what choice should you make? And that brings me lastly to the most important point I want to make in this lecture, which is that I do not think that university teachers should go around telling people what to think, especially not in very great universities like this one. You can all think. You all know this. This is what Wittgenstein calls assembling reminders. So that's what I've done. I've assembled reminders for a particular purpose. And that, I think, is the task of the teacher, to try to clarify what it is that one needs to be reminded of in order to think about it. And that's all I've tried to do in this lecture. I've tried to present to you with information relevant to answering the question, how should we think about our freedom? But as to the answer, well, I leave that to you. Thank you very much. Yes, hi, nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. This is just marvelous. But there's one thing I would like to know where you would fit it. Deception. We live in a world of ever more pervasive propaganda, deception, manipulation, distortion. And I'm not going to comment as to whether I'm talking about our current election, but just in general, right? And so my will could be bent. Others could interfere with my action by bending my will, I think, through deception rather than through a threat or any of the categories under threat. Or does it fit under self-realization as a distortion of our political essence? Like, if we are told there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, so we must go to war, et cetera, or something like that. Or does it go up there? Does it go down there? How? So it's very important, and it's the only thing I could think of that didn't fit the taxonomy. The taxonomy is marvelous.
Thank you, Jim. That's wonderful. And I'm inclined simply to add it under other possibilities, because, of course, manipulation is interference. And much has been written about this. But it's a particular kind of interference because it's one to which you might give assent without reading it as interference. So very high-pressure advertising is the standard case that would be given. You don't read that as interference, but you are mistaken in supposing that your choice was not bent.
I think it's ever more pervasive and it deserves mention.
Yeah, well, thank you. No, I'm absolutely, I hope the questions won't be as destructive as this all the time. But I'm very willing to accommodate that, because it's a very special kind of a case, because you have the illusion of freedom. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I thought of another possibility, and again, I'm not sure where it belongs, ignorance. That would be the classic 18th century possibility that would interfere with freedom. But a more general question...
No, say a bit more about that, Keith.
The argument would be one cannot be free unless one can understand the possibilities for action.
Sure.
And where people are kept in ignorance, then this is a form of oppression.
Yes.
And so that would be, again, it could be another possibility under several branches.
I'm inclined to think that that's going to run no interference by external agencies acting upon the will by coercion.
Yes, but one could keep oneself in ignorance too.
Oh, sure, but then in that case that comes out as under the self doing it. Yeah. Now, I think it copes with that, yes.
Another question, the impossibility of having a coherent view. This is a kind of Rortian question. Do we need a coherent view? Or do we need a set of arguments that will work at some points, in some cases, and a set of arguments that will work in other cases?
Well, this is a very Rortian lecture, and I'm very grateful to have that great name cited here, because what I understand Dick Rorty to be wanting to say most clearly, I think, in the first chapter of Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, is that these are all just vocabularies. And the question that we should be asking ourselves is, maybe about all these normative concepts, is, they're meant to be working for us. Which one is going to go deeply into our society and do the most for us? Which is the one that is really going to satisfy our sense that these are the problems that it's solving? So it's a very...
There may not be just one.
Well...
In any society.
No, of course that's right. And you could change your mind. I mean, it's very striking that this country was set up over here with that view, but it sort of ended up somewhere over here, hasn't it? In speaking generally. Sure. But what I'm saying is that in saying that, sure, you want a vocabulary, you want it to be working for us in the way that will answer our questions and be useful to us. Our concepts are what we bring to the world in order to make sense of that world, and we want the concept to make sense of our world. That will change. But what I meant to say was the idea that we can, from all of this, say, yeah, but what is freedom really? What is really freedom really? That's the mistake. But that's the mistake that analytical philosophy is. I was able to quote a very great exponent of it, quite explicitly making. There is no way in which you can put all of these together into a story. There's no way to get a narrative out of it, ex hypothesi. Yeah.
I have a question just over here. Hi.
Yeah, hi.
I wanted to ask you, actually, I think that your final remarks about dependence are going to hold the answer to my question, but I'm not sure exactly how, so I want to ask you anyway. My question is, it seems to me like there's more to the Marxian part of the genealogy than false consciousness. That is, it's not just that you're not free if you are subject to a false consciousness and you subscribe to a bourgeois view of the good life. But there's also a sort of further point, which is that, you can't, maybe that comes out of the Marxian moment of the genealogy, which is that you can't be free in a state of poverty. Maybe there's sort of a social democratic view of freedom, according to which, unless you have basic means of subsistence and maybe even access to a good education and health care,
yes, good.
Unless your government gives you those things, you can't really be free.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering, so does that, I think that your remarks about dependence can solve that problem, but I'm wondering how.
I like the way that you've linked this to the Marxist tradition, because it's a striking feature of Marx's writings in particular that he uses the vocabulary of slavery all the time, the wage slave, the dictatorship of the proletariat. I mean, he's talking in classical terms here, and this is essentially a classical theory. So that, yes, I think it would come up with undemocratic survivals, as I've called them, or it would come up here. So that the figure of the wage slave is a person who only has their labor to offer in a market. That's all they have to offer. And they're offering it to a boss who can dismiss them at will and with impunity. So they're a slave in that context. But so they're unfree. They are unfree, but they're unfree on this analysis of unfreedom. There would be a very interesting piece of intellectual history to be written about the relationship of the emergence of socialist thinking in the 19th century from this story, because socialism is the extension of this story in 19th century social philosophy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh gosh. Yes, thank you.
So there was something that you said in passing that really struck me, and I just want to preface that with a personal story. So my ancestors came from the colonized. When I came here and became a citizen, I was very struck by the notion of liberty in places other than America, and the defense of liberty, which was sort of, instead of the pursuit of liberty, it was really the defense of liberty that was very strongly emphasized here. So I'd love to hear your take on how it devolved from the liberty of a citizen to the liberty of a state that maintains citizens as unfree.
Yes, very interesting. Right, because it's an immediate implication of this way of thinking that you can only be free in a democracy. I mean, classical liberalism is not interested in the relationship of liberty to forms of government. Because if you say freedom is not interference, then what you're interested in is not the sources of political power, but the extent of it. So I could live under a dictatorship which, if I was a privileged person, might leave me pretty much completely free. I mean, obviously there are oligarchs in Russia who live like that. They're completely free on that analysis. But that's not the analysis that's being given here. This analysis says you're not free unless there is equal freedom. That's to say, everyone in the society has been relieved from conditions of dependence on arbitrary and dominating powers. So that has to be the aspiration of a democratic society, because what you end up with then is equal freedom. No one is subject to the domination of a power that is arbitrary. That's to say, can act contrary to their interests with impunity. It doesn't have to track their interests. Now, if that is true of everyone, you not only have equal freedom, you have social justice. So that would be the analysis that would be given here. So the state is thought to be irrelevant, really, to freedom in the classical liberal tradition. And that's how we come to turn classical liberalism into libertarianism. It's continually moving in that direction, is to think, well, look, freedom is a very great value of ours, but what it is to lose your freedom is to be interfered with. Who interferes with you? Well, the state. The law is an act of interference. It's an obvious act of external interference operating by coercion. So less law, more freedom. That's a recognizable story in this country in particular. And there's a continual tendency for liberalism to become libertarianism in that way. But if you think, well, that's not the right way to be thinking about freedom. The right way to be thinking about freedom is everyone, for it to be a free society, would have to be relieved from conditions that left them at the mercy of arbitrary power. So the people would have to be the rulers. There's no alternative but that the people are the rulers, because that's the only way in which there's not going to be arbitrary power. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. This is a little bit of a follow-up. This is a follow-up question, a little bit from the woman who asked a question 2 questions ago. So I'm fascinated by this idea of debates about wage slavery and our dependence on market forces as, you know, coming out of the Marxian tradition. I see sort of, on the other hand, this really kind of powerful piece of political rhetoric, at least in the United States, about the dangers of the welfare state being precisely the dangers of cultivating among the lower classes a culture of dependency, right? This is a term that we hear all the time. So I would be curious to hear from you to what extent you think that contemporary debates about freedom or liberty, at least in the context of democratic societies, as being fundamentally a debate between those who think that the greatest danger is dependency on this arbitrary capitalist system and those who think that the greatest danger is dependency on the state.
Yes, good. Well, the dependency that I'm talking about, this is extremely important to me, is very specific. It is dependency upon a dominating power. It's a status relationship of domination and dependence, which takes away freedom. So the power that generates the dependence that takes away freedom is an arbitrary power, where arbitrary is given the reading that a power is arbitrary if there is someone who can operate it with impunity without tracking your interests. They don't have to track your interests. They might, but they don't have to. And if they don't, that's done with impunity. That's what's arbitrary. That produces in that domain dependence. So that's to talk about dependence in a completely different way from people who say, well, people get dependent on welfare. That's not to be dependent on an arbitrary power. That doesn't take away their freedom on this analysis at all, because what we're talking about is being dependent on a power which is in respect of which you are at its mercy. So it's very unfortunate that this story has got all tangled up with talk about welfare dependence. Welfare dependence is dependence on the state. There may be arguments in favor of that being an innocent form of dependence, morally speaking, or there may be arguments of a moralizing kind that as it were, moralizes poverty. Poverty is your fault, something like that, in which case a very strong moral argument would be set up. That is completely separate from what I've talked about this evening. It's no part of what I've talked about. And it's very important to keep those separate, I think. Yeah. I'm very glad of the question, by the way, because I didn't clarify that, except insofar as I was careful to say what arbitrariness is. I'm only talking about arbitrariness. And by the way, I'm also only talking about domains. You could be a liber homo, a free man or woman, in many domains of your life, but there could be a domain of your life in which you are at somebody's mercy. If that's true of the whole of your life, you're a chattel slave, and we're not talking about that. But if it's true in any domain of your life, then you're not a liber homo. Yes, yeah, I'm actually out of control here. I'm going to hand over to superior authority. And yeah.
All right, hands up. I want to make sure. Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Are we still recording? Yes. Yeah. So have I been moving around too much? Don't turn that light on again.
Do what you have to do. I want him to be comfortable.
Right. He doesn't mean that.
Thank you. That was brilliant, and I really like your tie. I just wanted to
my daughter gave it to me. Yeah, it's good, isn't it?
It's amazing. Yeah.
It gets brighter.
Yeah, I'm glad I sat at the front. I had a quick and easy question. I noticed you took great care in your lecture to specify that you're talking about English language, genealogy, genealogies, and I just wanted to know if sort of the new field of global intellectual history played a role in the excavation of this genealogy, and how many new trees you might imagine for non-English language sources.
Well, thank you. Wonderful question. I mean, I did say at the outset that this decision to speak about the Anglo-American liberal tradition was arbitrary. I mean, it's completely arbitrary. But it is our tradition, isn't it? I mean, this is what's formed our identities. And so that was my excuse. It's an important fact about my genealogy that no proper names appear on it, do they? It's a kind of Christmas tree, and you can hang any number of names. I've mentioned a great number of names, but it is important to me that there are no names there. So if you could bring to bear an understanding of different traditions of thinking about freedom, I think they would be Western traditions, actually, but they would not be English language traditions. I would hope that you would find them somewhere on here. I mean, I do have ambitions for this diagram. It's taken me a long time to work it out. And one of the ambitions is that you can treat it as a Christmas tree. So if you were to say to me, well, where is Rousseau? I would be able to point him out to you. I mean, he's here, obviously. Sorry? Yes, well, I just don't know what to say. Yeah, it would be interesting to give this lecture in China, for example, is what you're saying. And would they think, well, we don't map it like this at all? I could imagine that that's right. This is working for Western, for sort of Latin-based languages, isn't it? That's all I would claim for it. No, I mean, it wouldn't have to be purely Latin-based, because presumably you can do all this in Finland as well, but I haven't tried. But this is a European and American story. But I just want to say that's not global, but Europe and America are important in the modern world, and this is what shaped our identity. So I'm being a bit defensive here, because obviously what you say is right, but I don't know how to carry that forward. I could, however, insert other European thinkers onto this with great ease. And we've talked a bit about Marx, we've talked a bit about Hegel, we could certainly add Rousseau. We could go on like that. Mm.
So we've had the front, so I'm going to grab it back.
Thank you. I have a difficulty with that self versus external agencies difference that you have, because I see passion as a response to an external motivator, and inauthenticity is a response to, again, another external motivator, the social norms, etc. So how are those external forces different than those of external agencies that you've separated them out?
Yeah, good. They're not seen as invading forces. They're seen, rightly or wrongly, as motivations. So what we were inquiring into here is the source of the motivations. I haven't gone into that, but obviously, in some cases, the source of these motivations will carry us in the direction that we were talking about here. But I think the distinction is a fairly clear one. Oh no, that's rather what you're contesting. But the way that the distinction would have to run is that, sure, you could say that there isn't a distinction, but these are also intruders. That's what you're saying. These are also intruders. Right, yeah. They're not perceived as intruders.
Well, I kind of see that if you're out there by yourself without anybody else, you're not going to have any anger or hatred, or you're not going to have any social norms.
Yes.
Sorry, to force you into an action.
Yes.
So it necessarily is interpersonal at that point, which is what you said external agencies are.
Yes. Well, that's what the tradition I was talking about would want to contest. I mean, they would want to make a very strong distinction between forms of motivation which are open to you. And that's the force in the rationalist tradition, of which I gave the example of Locke, in which freedom gets to be connected up with reason. That it's only the rational person who is free. That's what they want to say. But that's not because the person who's not rational is subject to an external force. He or she could be, but then that's easily accommodating. What Locke wants to say, and it's a quite standard move in rationalist philosophy, is to say the will, I mean, there's a geography of the will where the will can ally itself with reason. That produces freedom. If it allies itself and allows itself to be overcome by passion, and notice that a slave to passion, then that is not an externality, but it doesn't lead to freedom. It leads to what they call license. And this distinction between liberty and license is absolutely fundamental for them. It takes Hobbes and subsequently Hume to say what's gone completely wrong here, which is rather up your street, is there's no motivation which isn't a passion. I mean, what is this distinction between reason and the passions? Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, as Hume says, making an excellent joke about, slavery and freedom. So that's the radical move, is to say we've got the moral psychology wrong here, the philosophical psychology wrong here, that a passion is all that can motivate. But as long as you're in the rationalist tradition, you'll want to say, no, that can be conquered. Passion can always be conquered. And reason is the conqueror of passion. And that's autonomy. So it's simply an analysis of autonomy. Yeah.
So we can take one more question. Gosh, I know why you feel overwhelmed. Way in the back. Yes. Okay.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be the last person to ask a question. So it's been fascinating. So in the tradition that's on the left, liberty is denied if there is a possibility of arbitrary interference.
Yes, exactly.
But as we go through examples, they're all arbitrary, but they're not all equally an interference. And the questions that followed also emphasize the arbitrary portion and not the interference prong of that balance. And do you think that this tradition in modernity overemphasizes arbitrariness and underemphasizes interference?
Yeah, very good point. I mean, I'm inclined to put the question the other way around and to say, doesn't the liberal tradition underestimate the significance of silent power? By saying, look, there's got to be some visible interference, or it's got to be some structure of the psyche, which is what we've been talking about, or there's got to be some intruder. What this wants to say, and this is what's extremely important here, is that it's the fact of dependence that takes away freedom of action. There doesn't have to be even any threat of interference, but it's just the interpersonal knowledge that this could be happening. It's all counterfactual, but the claim is, first of all, that takes away autonomy, because everything that looks like a free action is actually a permission. So there's that epistemological point to be made. But the second point is self-censorship. And that's really central. Nothing has happened.
Right. And those are not, this is not the question. What my question is some of the actions of the boss, arguably are not interference, right? If somebody does not give you a job, that's arguably not interference, right? Even though it's arbitrary.
Yes.
So this is the angle from which I'm looking at it.
Yes. Well, look, the person who doesn't give you a job, I mean, they would not be very concerned about that. They would be concerned with the conditions of your labor if you're in a job. So that, for example, if you're in a job in which you can be fired without appeal and with impunity, they would think it certain that you would become self-censoring. And self-censorship is the undermining of autonomy on this analysis. So you have no chance of autonomy. You're a wage slave. I mean, that was what you were talking about. And that's the force of the Republican and, of course, also the socialist analysis, which insists on bringing back the vocabulary of slavery to talk about the conditions of people under industrial capitalism. Yeah. Well, I'm willing to take one more. No, I mean, apart from Jim Fishkin, nobody actually pulled the plug out yet, but they...
We have one more over here. Yes. The microphone is coming.
Oh, I've got to get back here.
Thank you. My question is about the arbitrariness in this chart that we see here on the left. Under contemporary examples of arbitrary power, you talk about undemocratic survivals, but you also talk about dependence on the arbitrary power of states more generally. And the example that you were using there was the power of surveillance of the modern state, both here in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in other European countries. Those are all democracies that impose these types of laws on their citizens. So I was wondering how you would reconcile that with the element of arbitrariness, and is there maybe an additional definition that we need that goes beyond just the fact that something is based on a democratic decision of a majority to limit state power within that framework?
People who are worried about powers of surveillance are worried about the extent to which these the use of these powers is unknown. So this information is being collected, and you could say that by representation that's been done by consent. But the question of what can be done with this is indeterminate. Insofar as we don't know, I mean, going back to what we were just saying, insofar as we don't know, and we're continually reassured, I mean, in the British Parliament, the Prime Minister said, you don't have to worry as long as you've done nothing wrong. Which didn't work very well, because, for example, he was going to say what it was to have done something wrong. And so the implication was that, well, these powers are there, and we don't know what could be done with these powers. Now, I have friends who work on some sensitive questions about climate change in one of the English universities. They've all given up email. Not because they know what's going to happen if they use email, but because they don't know what's going to happen. What use could be made of it? They don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe it's not important. But notice what they're doing. They're self-censoring. It would be much easier to use email. So that's the thing that these people are worrying about. Rightly or wrongly, I'm not here to say. I'm a genealogist. I'm not a moralist.
Well, please join me in thanking Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Stanford Humanities Center. For more information, please visit us at shc.stanford.edu.